During the summer of 1984, in a peaceful suburban neighborhood in Oregon, a 6-year-old girl suddenly vanished without a trace. Her mother had turned her back for exactly 3 minutes. When she looked outside again, the yard was entirely empty. Police searched the town for months, but they found no evidence, no witnesses, and no answers. The case quickly went cold, leaving a family completely broken and an entire community gripped by fear. But 27 years later, everything suddenly changed. An old, forgotten photograph was discovered hidden away in a dusty box. What that single image revealed exposed a dark, impossible secret and uncovered a truth no one was ever prepared for. Oak Creek was the kind of town where nothing bad ever happened. It was a place of deep green pine trees, wide streets, and quiet afternoons. The people who lived there knew their neighbors. They borrowed sugar, hosted weekend barbecues, and watched each other's children play in the front yards. Crime was something that happened on the evening news in big cities far away. In Oak Creek, people still left their front doors unlocked. They left the keys in their car ignitions while they ran into the grocery store. It was a safe place. It was the perfect place to raise a family. Eleanor Vance believed this with all her heart. She was 28 years old, a gentle woman with a warm smile and a deep love for her family. Eleanor had grown up in a noisy, crowded house, and she had always dreamed of having a quiet, beautiful home of her own. When she married her husband, Arthur, she thought all her dreams had come true. Arthur was a hardworking, respected man in the community. He managed the local hardware store right in the center of town. He was the kind of man who could fix anything, a man who always had a friendly word for his customers and a firm handshake for his friends. To the outside world, Arthur and Eleanor were the picture of a perfect American couple. But their greatest joy, the center of their entire universe, was their daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 6 years old with a wild mop of curly brown hair and bright, curious eyes. Lily was a miracle to Eleanor. Eleanor and Arthur had struggled for years to have a child. There were many doctors, many tears, and many quiet, heartbreaking nights before Lily finally came into their lives. Because of this, Eleanor loved her daughter with a fierce, protective intensity. She watched over Lily like a hawk. Lily was a joyful child, but she was also deeply cautious. She was not the kind of little girl who wandered off. She was actually quite timid around people she did not know. If a stranger spoke to her at the grocery store, she would hide behind Eleanor's legs and refuse to speak. She did not like loud noises, and she was afraid of the dark. She was a rule follower. If Eleanor told her to stay in the yard, Lily stayed in the yard. Lily also had a constant companion. It was a small, worn-out stuffed elephant named Barnaby. Barnaby was missing one button eye, and his gray fabric was faded from years of being carried everywhere, but Lily loved him. She never let him out of her sight. He slept next to her, he sat at the breakfast table with her, and he kept her safe when she was afraid. Life in the Vance household was a comfortable, predictable routine. Every morning, Arthur would wake up early, drink his black coffee, and head off to the hardware store. Eleanor would make breakfast for Lily, and they would spend their days doing simple things. They baked cookies, they read stories on the living room rug, and they played in the backyard. Arthur had built the fence around the backyard himself. It was a massive, solid wooden privacy fence standing 6 feet tall. He built it shortly after Lily was born, telling Eleanor that he wanted his girls to be perfectly safe. The fence completely enclosed the yard. The only way in or out was a heavy wooden gate on the side of the house. The gate had a thick iron latch at the very top, positioned high out of the reach of a child. It was a stiff, rusty latch. Even Eleanor had to push hard to lift it. Lily, at 6 years old, could not even reach it on her tiptoes, let alone open it. The backyard was a fortress. It was the safest place in the world. But August 14, 1984, was the day the fortress failed. It started like any other ordinary Tuesday. The morning sun was bright, shining through the kitchen window and warming the yellow linoleum floor. Eleanor stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. Lily sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas, chattering away about a cartoon she had watched the night before. Barnaby the elephant was sitting on the table beside her plate. Arthur came down the stairs, dressed in his work clothes. He seemed a little distracted that morning, packing slightly as he drank his coffee. Alina asked him if everything was all right. Arthur forced a smile and kissed her cheek. He said he was just stressed about a massive shipment of lumber arriving at the store that day. He said it was going to be a long, exhausting shift, and that he probably wouldn't be home until late in the evening. He kissed the top of Lily's head, told her to be a good girl for her mother, and walked out the front door. Alina watched from the window as his blue truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. The morning passed quietly. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the summer heat had become completely oppressive. The air was thick and heavy, and the sky was a bright, blinding blue. Lily was wearing her favorite bright yellow bathing suit. She begged Alina to turn on the sprinkler in the backyard so she could run through the water and cool off. Alina agreed. She walked Lily out to the back patio. She dragged the green garden hose to the center of the grass, attached the metal sprinkler, and turned the spigot. The water shot up in a fan, ticking back and forth, throwing cool droplets across the lawn. Lily squealed with delight and immediately started jumping through the water. Barnaby the elephant was placed carefully on a dry patio chair, watching her. Alina smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. She told Lily she was going inside just for a moment to grab a glass of ice water and check on a pot of sweet tea she had boiling on the stove. "Stay right here in the water, sweetie," Alina said. "I will, Mommy," Lily called back, laughing as the cold water hit her face. Alina walked back into the house. The kitchen was just steps away from the back door. There was a large window above the kitchen sink that looked directly out into the yard. Alina walked to the stove and turned off the burner under the tea. As she reached for a glass from the cupboard, the yellow rotary phone on the kitchen wall suddenly began to ring. The sound was loud and jarring in the quiet house. Alina hesitated. She glanced out the window. She could clearly see Lily jumping in the water, her yellow bathing suit bright against the green grass. Alina took 2 steps and picked up the heavy phone receiver. "Hello," she said. There was no answer. "Hello, is anyone there?" she asked again. There was only a thick, heavy static on the line. It wasn't completely silent. She could hear a faint, rhythmic breathing sound, like someone was holding the phone close to their mouth but refusing to speak. "Arthur, is that you?" Alina asked, thinking perhaps her husband was calling from a loud warehouse. Still, there was no response, just the static and the soft breathing. Then a sharp click. The line went dead. Alina frowned, a strange feeling of unease washing over her. She hung up the phone. She shook her head, assuming it was a wrong number or a prank call from a neighborhood kid. She walked to the sink, filled her glass with ice water, and took a long drink. In total, she had been inside the house for exactly 3 minutes. She turned and looked out the window over the sink again. The metal sprinkler was still ticking back and forth, spraying water over the green grass. But Lily was not there. Alina's heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter. She assumed Lily had just run to the side of the house to chase a butterfly or look at a flower. She set her water glass down on the counter. She pushed open the screen door and stepped out onto the hot concrete of the patio. "Lily," Alina called out. Her voice sounded normal, unbothered. There was no answer, just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the sprinkler. "Lily, sweetie, where are you? Come back into the water." Silence. Alina walked down the patio steps onto the wet grass. She looked behind the large oak tree in the corner of the yard. She looked behind the storage shed. Nothing. The yard was completely empty. Then she turned and looked toward the side of the house. The heavy wooden gate was wide open. Alina stopped breathing. The gate was never open. Arthur had drilled into her head how important it was to keep that gate securely latched at all times. And more importantly, Lily could not open it. The iron latch was far too high and far too heavy. Alina began to run. She sprinted across the wet grass, slipping slightly in the mud, her bare feet hitting the ground hard. She reached the open gate and rushed through it, stumbling into the front yard. "Lily," she screamed, panic finally breaking through her voice. She looked up the street. She looked down the street. The road was entirely empty. The heat waves were rising off the black asphalt, making the distant trees look distorted and blurry. There were no cars driving away. There were no children playing. It was dead, terrifyingly quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. "Lily, Lily, answer me." Alina spun around in circles, her chest heaving. A cold, heavy dread dropped into her stomach, a primal terror that only a mother can feel. She ran back through the gate, desperately hoping Lily was hiding, hoping this was all just a terrible game of hide-and-seek. As she ran back through the gate, her foot hit something soft in the mud just inside the fence line. She looked down. Lying face down in the wet dirt, right beneath the open gate, was Barnaby the elephant. Lily would never drop Barnaby in the mud. She would never leave him outside. She protected that toy fiercely. Seeing the toy lying abandoned in the dirt shattered the last piece of Alina's hope. Something was terribly wrong, really wrong. Alina dropped to her knees, snatched the muddy toy from the ground, and clutched it to her chest. She let out a scream that tore through the quiet suburban afternoon. It was a sound of absolute agony. Doors began to open up and down the street. Martha, the older woman who lived next door, came running out of her house holding a gardening trowel. "Alina, Alina, dear heaven, what is it? What's wrong?" Martha yelled as she hurried across the lawn. "She's gone, Lily is gone," Alina sobbed, pointing wildly at the open gate. "She was just here, she was right here." Martha dropped her trowel. Her face went pale. She immediately began checking the bushes near the front porch. "Lily, Lily, honey, come out." Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was outside. People were checking their garages, looking under their cars, and calling the little girl's name. But there was no sign of the bright yellow bathing suit. There was no sign of the curly brown hair. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed her whole. Alina ran into the house, her hands shaking violently as she picked up the kitchen phone. She dialed 911. The operator answered, and Alina could barely speak through her hyperventilation. She managed to give her address and choke out the words that her 6-year-old daughter was missing. Next, she called the hardware store. The phone rang 3 times before an employee answered. Alina demanded to speak to Arthur. "Arthur Vance." His deep voice came over the line a moment later. "Arthur, come home," Alina gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Come home right now." "Alina, what's wrong? You sound—" "It's Lily," Alina cried. "Arthur, she's gone. Someone took her. The gate is open and she's gone." There was a horrible, hollow silence on the other end of the line. Then, the sound of the phone dropping heavily to the floor. The first police cruiser arrived less than 5 minutes later, its sirens wailing and red and blue lights flashing against the houses. Chief Miller, an older man who had known the Vance family for years, stepped out of the car. He looked grim. In a town like Oak Creek, a missing child call was the absolute worst-case scenario. More officers arrived. They swarmed the house. They checked every room, every closet, and every cabinet. They looked in the washing machine. They looked in the attic. They looked in the trunk of Alina's car. They searched with a frantic, desperate energy, tearing the house apart looking for any sign of a hiding child. Arthur arrived 10 minutes later. His truck came flying down the street, jumping the curb and tearing up the grass in the front yard. He threw the door open and sprinted toward the house, his face red and covered in sweat. When he saw Alina sitting on the front porch steps, clutching the muddy stuffed elephant and sobbing, he fell to his knees in the driveway. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. Chief Miller had to help him up and guide him into the house. The afternoon turned into a nightmare. The police established a command center in the Vance family living room. They began knocking on every door within a 3-mile radius. They asked every neighbor the same questions. Did you see a strange car? Did you see anyone walking down the street? Did you hear a scream? The answers were always the same. No, no one saw anything. No one heard anything. Chief Miller sat down with a leaner at the kitchen table. He was gentle, but his questions were sharp. He needed to understand exactly what happened in those 3 minutes. "Alina, are you absolutely sure you locked the gate this morning?" Chief Miller asked, his notebook open. "I didn't open the gate today," Alina said, her voice shaking. "I never open it. Arthur is the only one who uses it when he takes the trash out, and he always locks it. He always locks it." Chief Miller looked over at Arthur, who was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. "Arthur, did you lock the gate when you took the trash out this morning?" the chief asked. Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Yes, I swear to God I locked it. I pulled the latch down tight. I always do." The chief nodded slowly. He walked out to the backyard to inspect the gate again. He looked at the heavy iron latch. There were no scratches on it. It had not been forced open or broken. Someone had simply lifted it, walked in, and taken the child. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the state police arrived. They brought tracking dogs. The large German shepherds were given one of Lily's unwashed sweaters from her bedroom. The dogs sniffed the sweater, ran out to the backyard, and immediately picked up her scent near the sprinkler. They tracked the scent to the open gate, out onto the sidewalk, and stopped right at the edge of the street. The dogs paced back and forth at the curb, whining and spinning in circles. They could not track the scent any further. "What does that mean?" Arthur demanded, yelling at the dog handler. "Why are they stopping?" "It means she got into a vehicle right here," the handler said quietly. "The scent just ends. I'm sorry, Mr. Vance." As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the neighborhood, the reality of the situation finally settled over the house. Floodlights were set up in the street. Helicopters chopped through the night sky, shining massive searchlights into the nearby woods. Hundreds of volunteers from the town gathered with flashlights, walking shoulder to shoulder through the dark, calling Lily's name into the empty night. Alina sat alone in Lily's bedroom. The room smelled like baby shampoo and crayons. The bed was perfectly made, waiting for a little girl who was not coming home. Alina held the muddy stuffed elephant to her face, breathing in the smell of the damp earth. She kept replaying those 3 minutes in her mind over and over again. The ringing phone, the heavy static, the click, the empty yard. But as she sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of police radios echoing in the hallway, a terrifying realization suddenly washed over her. It was a detail so chilling it made her blood run completely cold. Lily was terrified of strangers. If a stranger had walked through that gate and tried to grab her, Lily would have screamed. She would have kicked, she would have cried, and she would have fought. Alina was only a few feet away, standing by the open kitchen window. She would have heard a scream. She would have heard a struggle. But there was no scream. There was no noise at all. Whoever walked through that heavy wooden gate, whoever unlatched it and stepped into the yard, was not a stranger. Lily went with them quietly. The realization hit Alina so hard she felt physically sick. She stood up from the edge of Lily's bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran down the hallway and practically fell down the wooden stairs. Chief Miller was standing in the living room, talking quietly with another officer. Alina grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his dark blue uniform. She explained what she had just realized. She explained how timid Lily was. She explained that if a stranger had grabbed her daughter, Lily would have screamed loud enough to wake the dead. Alina was only a few feet away, standing by the open kitchen window. The only sound she had heard was the ticking of the metal sprinkler. Lily had walked away quietly. She had trusted the person who took her. Chief Miller's face changed. The gentle, comforting look of a family friend vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating stare of a seasoned investigator. He pulled a small notebook from his chest pocket and wrote something down. He walked into the kitchen and stared at the yellow rotary phone hanging on the wall. He asked Alina to explain the phone call again. He asked for every single detail. Alina repeated the story, the sudden ringing, the 3 minutes she was inside, the heavy, rhythmic breathing on the line, the thick static, the sharp click before the line went dead. Chief Miller turned to look out the kitchen window, directly at the spot where the sprinkler was still sitting in the wet grass. He traced the line of sight from the window to the heavy wooden gate. "The caller wasn't a prank," Chief Miller said, his voice low and tight. "It was a decoy. They were watching the house. They waited until you were inside and they called the number to keep you distracted. They knew exactly how much time they needed." This single deduction changed the entire direction of the investigation. The police were no longer looking for a random drifter passing through Oak Creek in a rusty car. They were looking for someone who knew the family's routine. They were looking for someone who knew Lily. They were looking for someone who knew the Vance phone number by heart. The next morning, the police expanded their search, but their methods shifted. Detectives began knocking on the doors of everyone who had ever stepped foot inside the Vance home. They questioned the local mailman. They questioned the teenager who mowed their lawn on the weekends. They interviewed every single neighbor, asking not just what they saw, but how well they knew the little girl with the curly brown hair. Every interview ended in a frustrating dead end. The mailman was miles away on a different route. The teenage lawnmower was in summer school. The neighbors were all accounted for. Everyone was horrified. Everyone wanted to help, but no one had any useful answers. By the third day, the atmosphere in the town began to sour. The initial wave of hopeful community support started to fade into a dark, paranoid suspicion. People began locking their doors during the day. Parents stopped letting their children ride bicycles down the street. The safe, perfect town of Oak Creek was suddenly terrified of its own shadow. And then, as is standard procedure in any missing child case, the police turned their attention to the parents. It started with a request for Arthur to come down to the police station. It was not a formal arrest. Chief Miller told him it was just a routine interview to clear up some timelines. But when Arthur walked into the small, windowless interrogation room, the mood was incredibly tense. Two state detectives sat across from him, sliding a notepad onto the metal table. They asked Arthur to detail his entire day. Arthur explained that he woke up, drank his coffee, and went to the hardware store. He said he had a massive shipment of lumber arriving that morning, and he was busy organizing the warehouse. "Were you at the store the entire day, Arthur?" one of the detectives asked. Arthur nodded quickly. "Yes, I was there until Alina called me. I dropped the phone and drove straight home." The detective looked down at his notes. "That's strange, because we spoke to your floor manager, a young man named David. David said you left the store around 1:30 in the afternoon. He said you told him you were going to pick up some supplies, but you were gone for nearly an hour. You came back empty-handed just before 2:30. Lily had vanished right around 2 o'clock. Arthur's face went completely pale. He stammered, rubbing his hands together nervously. He told the detectives that he had lied to his manager. He wasn't picking up supplies. He said he had a terrible, splitting headache from the stress of the lumber delivery. He said he had driven to a small diner on the edge of town, parked in the back lot, and just sat in his truck to eat a sandwich in peace and quiet. He said he needed an hour to clear his head. "Did anyone at the diner see you?" the detective asked. Arthur shook his head. "I didn't go inside, I just sat in the truck. I was alone." It was a terrible alibi. It was the worst possible alibi a father could have. An unexplained absence. No witnesses. A timeline that matched the exact window of his daughter's disappearance. When Alina found out about the missing hour, she felt a cold, sharp knife twist in her stomach. She loved her husband. She trusted him completely. Arthur was a good man. He loved Lily more than life itself. He had built the privacy fence just to keep her safe. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. But the seed of doubt had been planted. And once doubt takes root, it is almost impossible to pull out. Alina started watching Arthur closely. She noticed how much he was drinking. Before the disappearance, Arthur might have had a single beer on a Friday night. Now he was pouring thick glasses of dark whiskey every evening, staring silently at the blank television screen. He stopped going to work. He stopped talking to Alina. He stopped crying. He just seemed hollow, like a ghost haunting his own house. When Alina asked him about the diner, he snapped at her. He yelled, his face turning red, asking how she could ever suspect him of hurting their own daughter. The fight was loud and bitter, echoing through the empty rooms of the house. After that night, they slept in separate bedrooms. The tragedy had not pulled them together. It had blown them completely apart. Weeks turned into months. The stifling summer heat faded into a crisp, cold autumn. The leaves in the backyard turned orange and brown, falling off the large oak tree and covering the grass. The sprinkler had been disconnected and thrown into the shed. The heavy wooden gate remained securely locked with a brand new padlock. The police investigation slowly ground to a halt. The tracking dogs had found nothing. The helicopters had been called off. The state detectives packed up their files and drove back to the city, leaving Chief Miller to handle the cold case alone. Every Friday afternoon, Alina would walk into the police station and sit in the wooden chair across from the chief's desk. She would ask if there were any new leads. Every Friday, the chief would shake his head, his eyes full of pity, and say no. Missing posters were taped to every telephone pole in Oak Creek. Lily's smiling face looked out from the bulletin board at the grocery store, from the window of the post office, and from the front counter of the hardware store. But as the winter wind began to howl through the streets, the posters began to tear. The rain washed out the ink. People stopped looking at them. The town was moving on. But Alina was trapped in time. She refused to change a single thing in Lily's bedroom. The toys remained exactly where they had been left. The closet was full of tiny dresses. The muddy stuffed elephant, Barnaby, sat carefully washed and dried on top of Lily's pillow. Alina kept the house perfectly clean, waiting for the day the front door would open and her little girl would run inside. Hope was a dangerous, painful thing, but it was the only thing keeping Alina breathing. Then, exactly 6 months after Lily vanished, the heavy silence of the case was suddenly shattered. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in February. Snow was falling heavily, covering the front yard in a thick blanket of white. Alina was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window, when she saw Chief Miller's police cruiser slowly pull into the driveway. He didn't have his sirens on. He turned off the engine and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. Finally, he stepped out into the snow, carrying a brown manila folder under his arm. Alina's heart leaped into her throat. The police did not make house calls on cold cases unless something major had happened. She ran to the front door and pulled it open before the chief even reached the porch. "Did you find her?" Alina gasped, the cold air rushing into the hallway. "Is she okay?" Chief Miller took off his hat and stepped inside. He looked incredibly tired. "No, Alina, we haven't found Lily. I'm so sorry." Alina felt the strength leave her legs. She leaned heavily against the wall. "Then why are you here?" "Where is Arthur?" the chief asked quietly. "He's asleep. He had a rough night," Alina said, glancing up the stairs. "What is this about, Chief?" Chief Miller walked into the living room and set the brown folder down on the coffee table. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single, typed sheet of paper covered in numbers and timestamps. "Back in August, right after Lily was taken, I requested a detailed telephone trace report from the regional switching center," the chief explained, his voice grim. "Technology isn't great, and the phone company drags their feet on local lines. It took them 6 months to manually sort through the switchboard logs from that specific day. Eleanor stared at the paper. The phone call, the decoy call. Yes, the chief nodded. We finally tracked down exactly where that call came from. The one with the heavy breathing. The one that made you turn your back on the yard. Who was it? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Did someone from town make the call? Chief Miller looked up from the paper and met Eleanor's eyes. His expression was a mix of sorrow and deep, genuine alarm. The call didn't come from a house, Eleanor. It was placed from a public payphone. Eleanor frowned, confused. A payphone, which one? It was placed from the payphone located directly in the parking lot of Arthur's hardware store, the chief said. And the timestamp on the call is 2:03 p.m. Exactly the same time Arthur claims he was sitting alone in his truck, just a few blocks away. Eleanor stopped breathing. The room seemed to spin. The person who had watched the house, the person who had orchestrated the perfect distraction to take her daughter, had used the phone just steps away from where her husband worked. Something was wrong, really, really wrong, and the mystery was no longer just outside her doors, it was inside her house. The revelation hanging in the cold air of the living room felt like a physical blow. Eleanor stared at Chief Miller, her mind struggling to process the impossible information. The decoy phone call, the single distraction that had cost her everything, had been placed from the payphone right outside Arthur's hardware store, and it had been placed at the exact moment Arthur claimed to be sitting alone in his truck just down the road. Eleanor did not wait for the police to bring Arthur in. She marched directly up the wooden stairs, her fists clenched so tightly her fingernails dug into her palms. She pushed open the bedroom door. Arthur was lying on his back, staring blankly at the ceiling, looking exhausted and hollow. Eleanor threw the police report onto his chest. She screamed at him to explain it. She demanded to know why the call came from his store. She demanded to know who he was talking to, what kind of trouble he was in, and what he had done with their little girl. Arthur sat up, his eyes wide with confusion. He looked at the paper. When he read the timestamp and the location, the remaining color drained completely from his face. He began to shake his head violently. Eleanor, no, you can't believe this, Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. I didn't make that call. I was at the diner. I swear to you on Lily's life, I was sitting in my truck at the diner. Then who made the call, Arthur? Eleanor yelled, tears streaming down her face. Who was standing in your parking lot looking at your store, calling your house? I don't know, Arthur cried out, burying his face in his hands. Maybe someone who works for me, maybe a customer, I don't know. But the police did not believe his desperate excuses, and neither did the town of Oak Creek. The news of the phone trace leaked to the public a few days later. In a tight-knit community, secrets are impossible to keep. The town's sympathy for the grieving father vanished overnight, replaced by a dark, furious judgment. People stopped shopping at the hardware store. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the Vance house. Someone spray-painted the word murderer in bright red paint across the driver's side of Arthur's truck. The police hauled Arthur into the station for relentless, grueling interrogations. They pushed him, they threatened him, and they tried to break him down. They believed he had accidentally harmed Lily and orchestrated the kidnapping story to cover his tracks. But Arthur never changed his story. He never confessed. And because the payphone was in a public place with dozens of people walking past it every day, the police had no physical evidence tying him directly to the receiver. They did not have enough proof to make an arrest. Arthur walked free, but his life was completely over. The doubt was a terrible, corrosive poison in Eleanor's heart. She tried to look at her husband and see the gentle man who had built the wooden fence to protect their daughter. But every time she looked at him, she thought of the 3 minutes. She thought of the heavy breathing on the phone line. She simply could not live with the uncertainty. 6 months later, their marriage officially broke. Arthur packed a single suitcase, left the house, and drove away. He moved to a cheap, run-down apartment in a neighboring city. He drank heavily to numb the pain of losing his daughter and his wife. 10 years later, in the winter of 1995, Arthur Vance died of a massive heart attack, completely alone in his apartment. He took whatever secrets he had to his grave. After Arthur left, Alina remained in the house in Oak Creek. She lived like a ghost. She kept her head down, worked as a clerk at the local library, and spent her evenings reading in the quiet living room. She never changed a single detail in Lily's bedroom. The muddy stuffed elephant, Barnaby, remained perfectly placed on the pillow. Years turned into decades. The town modernized. New houses were built, new families moved in, and the tragedy of the little girl in the yellow bathing suit slowly faded into local legend. People forgot. But Alina never forgot. She lived every single day trapped in August 1984. Time passed and hope faded. 27 years went by. It was the summer of 2011. Alina was now 55 years old. Her brown hair had turned a soft silver, and the years of grief had carved deep lines around her tired eyes. The house had become too heavy for her to carry. The stairs were getting harder to climb, and the empty rooms echoed with too many painful memories. She made the heartbreaking decision to finally put the house up for sale and move into a small, quiet apartment across town. To prepare for the sale, she had to clear out 27 years of accumulated memories. She spent weeks sorting through the garage, the basement, and the closets. Finally, she reached the attic. The attic was hot, dusty, and filled with cardboard boxes that had not been opened since the 1980s. Alina sat on the wooden floorboards, sorting through old winter coats and holiday decorations. Deep in the back corner of the attic, shoved behind an old broken lamp, she found a heavy, taped-up box. Written on the side in black marker were the words, "Living Room 1984*." It was a box packed by Alina's sister during the chaotic weeks after the disappearance. Her sister had come over to clean the house while Alina was immobilized by grief, sweeping up random items from the living room and putting them away to make the space look tidy for the police. Alina had never bothered to open it. She pulled a pocket knife from her apron and sliced through the yellowed, brittle tape. She folded back the cardboard flaps. A cloud of stale dust rose into the air. Inside the box were old magazines, a few broken ceramic coasters, a television remote, and a heavy, silver object tucked into a leather case. Alina reached in and pulled the leather case out. She unclasped the metal button and let the case fall open. Resting in her hands was Arthur's old Canon 35 film camera. She stared at it, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. They had used this camera for everything. Birthdays, holidays, trips to the park. She ran her thumb over the cold metal of the top plate. As she did, she looked down at the mechanical frame counter dial next to the shutter button. The tiny dial displayed the number *22*. Alina's breath hitched in her throat. The camera held a roll of 24 exposures. That meant there was still a roll of film inside. It had been sitting in the dark, trapped inside the metal casing, for 27 years. Her mind began to race. She tried to remember the last time they had used the camera. It was the summer of 1984. She distinctly remembered having the camera sitting on the kitchen counter during those hot August weeks. She had been taking random pictures of Lily around the house. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What if there were pictures of Lily on that roll? What if there were unseen memories, frozen in time, just waiting in the dark? Alina did not care about packing anymore. She grabbed her car keys, carried the camera downstairs, and drove straight to a specialized photography lab in the city center. She placed the silver camera on the glass counter. The young technician behind the counter looked at the camera with a skeptical expression. He opened the back in a darkroom tent, retrieved the old film canister, and examined it. "Ma'am, this film is incredibly old," the technician warned her gently. "It's expired, and it's been subjected to decades of heat and cold in an attic. The chemicals on the film strip degrade over time. I can try to process it using a special salvage bath, but I cannot guarantee anything will come out. It might just be blank. Please, Alina said, her voice shaking with desperate emotion. Just try. I will pay whatever it costs. Just try to save them. The technician nodded. He told her it would take a week of careful processing. That week was pure agony. Alina barely slept. She paced the empty floors of her house, staring at the kitchen window, thinking about what might be on that fragile strip of plastic. Finally, on a rainy Thursday morning, the phone rang. The technician told her she could come pick up her photos. Alina drove to the shop through the pouring rain. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely hold the steering wheel. She walked into the shop, paid the fee, and was handed a flat white envelope. She didn't wait to go home. She walked out to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The rain hammered loudly against the windshield, drowning out the noise of the city. She took a deep breath, opened the flap of the envelope, and slid the stack of photographs out. The technician had been right. The years had not been kind to the film. The first few pictures were heavily distorted, covered in strange green and purple color shifts, with large white burns across the edges. She saw a blurry image of Arthur grilling hot dogs. She saw a heavily damaged picture of Martha, the next-door neighbor, waving from her driveway. Then she flipped to the final 3 photos on the stack. These photos had been deeper inside the film roll, protected from the heat and light. They were remarkably clear. The colors were slightly faded, looking like a vintage dream, but the images were sharp. Alina let out a sharp, ragged sob. It was Lily. The first photo showed Lily sitting at the kitchen table, wearing her pajamas, eating a plate of pancakes. Her curly brown hair was a messy halo around her head. Barnaby the elephant was sitting next to her juice glass. It was a picture Alina had taken on the morning of August 14, 1984, the very last morning. Alina traced her thumb over her daughter's smiling face, tears blurring her vision. She flipped to the next photo. It was a candid shot taken from inside the house. Alina remembered it instantly. She remembered standing at the kitchen sink, filling a glass with ice water. She remembered holding the camera, looking out the window, and thinking how beautiful her daughter looked in the sunlight. She had snapped a quick photo right through the window glass, just seconds before the yellow rotary phone on the wall began to ring. Alina stared at the photograph. The framing was perfectly centered on the backyard. She could see the metal sprinkler spraying water high into the air. She could see Lily mid-jump, her bright yellow bathing suit standing out against the green grass. She could see Barnaby the elephant sitting safely on the dry patio chair. It was a perfect, innocent moment frozen forever in time. But as Alina wiped her tears away to look closer, her eyes drifted past her daughter. Her eyes moved to the background of the photograph, toward the heavy wooden privacy fence. Alina stopped breathing. The blood rushed out of her head, leaving her dizzy and cold. The photograph captured a detail she had completely missed that day. A detail her brain had simply failed to process while she was distracted by the water and the sunshine. In the background of the picture, the heavy wooden gate was not closed. It was already cracked open. The thick iron latch had already been lifted. And standing directly in the narrow gap of the open gate, half hidden by the dark shadow of the wooden fence, was a figure. Someone was standing there, watching Lily. Someone was already inside the boundary of the yard before the phone ever rang. Alina's hands shook uncontrollably. She fumbled in her purse, pulled out her reading glasses, and shoved them onto her face. She held the photograph up to the interior car light, squinting at the dark shadow by the gate. The camera focus was fixed on Lily in the foreground, so the figure in the background was slightly soft. But it was clear enough. It was not a stranger. It was not a faceless drifter. The figure standing in the open gate was wearing a very distinct, bright blue work shirt. a shirt with a small, white embroidered patch on the left chest pocket. It was the exact uniform shirt worn by the employees of Arthur's hardware store. But it wasn't Arthur. The person was too tall, too thin. The person was leaning casually against the wood, holding something in their hand. Alina squinted harder, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm. She looked at the face. The features were shadowed, but the bone structure, the short haircut, and the posture were instantly recognizable. It was a face she knew. It was a face that had sat in her living room, drank her coffee, and helped search the woods for her daughter. And seeing that face standing in her yard, watching her child just seconds before the disappearance, changed absolutely everything. The rain hammered violently against the windshield of Alina's car, but she did not hear it. She did not feel the cold dampness seeping through her thin sweater. She could not feel her hands gripping the edges of the photograph. The entire world had shrunk down to the 2-inch square of glossy paper resting under the yellow glow of the interior car light. She stared at the face in the background of the image, the face hiding in the shadow of the open gate. It was David. Alina remembered him so clearly. He was a young man, only 22 years old at the time. He had sandy blonde hair, a bright, easy smile, and a quiet demeanor. Arthur had hired him to help manage the heavy inventory at the hardware store. David had been to their house for dinner on multiple occasions. He had sat at their kitchen table. He had eaten Alina's cooking. He had smiled at Lily, handing her small pieces of candy from his pocket. And after Lily vanished, David had been one of the first people to arrive at the house. Alina remembered him standing in the living room, his face pale and tight with apparent grief, promising Arthur that he would help search every single inch of the surrounding woods. He had hugged Alina. He had told her everything was going to be all right. The absolute, sickening betrayal of it hit Alina with the force of a physical blow. She doubled over the steering wheel, a harsh, ragged gasp tearing from her throat. Her stomach violently twisted. The man who had eaten at her table was the monster standing in her yard. But as the initial shock began to subside, leaving behind a cold, burning clarity, Alina's mind began to race. A terrifying puzzle was slowly piecing itself together in her head. She remembered the official police timeline. She remembered the brown manila folder Chief Miller had brought to her house 6 months after the disappearance. The decoy phone call. Chief Miller had told her the call came from the payphone in the hardware store parking lot at exactly 2:03 p.m. The exact minute Lily was taken. The exact minute Arthur claimed to be eating alone in his truck. That piece of evidence had destroyed Arthur. It had convinced the town that Arthur had arranged the kidnapping. But if David was standing in Alina's backyard at 2:03 p.m., waiting by the wooden gate, he could not have made that phone call. The hardware store was a 10-minute drive from the house. No one can be in two places at once. Which meant David had an accomplice. Someone else was standing at that payphone. Alina turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. She slammed the car into drive and pulled out of the parking lot, her tires spinning on the wet asphalt. She didn't drive to the police station. The Oak Creek Police Department was located right in the center of town. The current chief of police was a man named Harris, an officer who had been personally trained and promoted by the old Chief Miller. In a town like Oak Creek, the police protected their own. Alina knew that walking into that station with a blurry, 27-year-old photograph would be a fatal mistake. They would take the photo, file a report, and tell her they would look into it. And then, whoever was involved would have plenty of time to run. She needed to understand exactly what had happened before she involved the authorities. She needed to know who else was involved. Alina drove back to her empty, half-packed house. She left the car running in the driveway and ran up the front steps, unlocking the door with shaking hands. She ran straight to her bedroom closet. Stacked in the back corner beneath old blankets was a heavy plastic storage bin. It was the box where she kept every single piece of paper, every newspaper clipping, and every flyer related to her daughter's case. She ripped the lid off the bin. She dug her hands through the piles of fatting paper until she found it, the brown manila folder. She pulled it out and carried it to the kitchen table. She turned on the bright overhead light. She opened the folder and stared at the single, typed sheet of paper, the official phone company trace report, the document that had ruined her husband's life. She read the words again. Originating location, public pay terminal, 402 Elm Street, Vance Hardware lot, time 2:03 p.m. Alina stared at the black ink pressed into the white paper. Something about it had always bothered her, but her grief had blinded her to the details. Now, with the cold clarity of anger, she looked closer. She looked at the shape of the letters. This was 1984. The phone company sent official reports on printed, watermarked paper, but this document was typed on a standard typewriter. Alina dug back into the plastic bin. She pulled out an official police press release from the first week of the search. She laid the press release side by side with the phone trace report. She pulled her reading glasses from her purse and bent over the table, examining the text line by line. Her breath caught in her throat. On the police press release, the lowercase letter E sat slightly higher than the rest of the letters. The metal key was slightly bent, and the capital letter R had a tiny chip missing from the bottom right tail. She looked at the phone trace report. The lowercase e was sitting high. The capital R had a chipped tail. The phone company had not generated this document. Chief Miller had typed it himself. He had fabricated the trace location. There was never a call from the hardware store payphone. He had invented that detail specifically to frame Arthur, knowing Arthur had no alibi for that hour. He had steered the entire investigation away from his own department, away from the truth, and directly onto an innocent, grieving father. But why? Why would the chief of police, a man who had sworn to protect the town, go to such elaborate criminal lengths to protect a young hardware store manager? Alina gathered the papers, shoved them into her purse, and ran back out to her car. It was near midnight, and the rain was still pouring down, turning the streets of Oak Creek into slick, black rivers. Alina drove to the local library where she had worked for the last 2 decades. She parked in the alleyway behind the building. She unlocked the heavy steel staff door and stepped into the dark, silent building. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and floor wax. She did not turn on the main overhead lights. She used a small flashlight from the custodian's desk to navigate the rows of tall bookshelves until she reached the basement stairs. She walked down into the subterranean archives room. This was where the library kept decades of local history, property deeds, birth records, death certificates, and old town newspapers, all stored on spools of microfiche film. Alina sat down at the heavy metal microfiche machine. She turned it on. The glass screen glowed with a harsh, bright white light in the dark room. She opened the metal filing cabinets and pulled out the newspaper spools from 1982 and 1983. She threaded the film through the machine and began turning the heavy plastic dial, scrolling through thousands of pages of old news. She was looking for any mention of David. She needed a last name. Her eyes burned from the glaring light, but she refused to stop. Finally, in the community section of an April 1983 edition of the Oak Creek Gazette, she found a small column celebrating local business hires. Arthur Vance, owner of Vance Hardware, is pleased to welcome his new floor manager, David Lawrence Miller, to the Oak Creek community. Alina stopped turning the dial. The name echoed in her mind like a gunshot. David Lawrence Miller. Miller. Chief Miller. She quickly rewound the spool, ejected it, and ran to a different cabinet. She pulled the town's birth and marriage records. She loaded the new spool and spun the dial frantically. She searched the marriage licenses for Chief William Miller. She found it. Chief Miller had been married in 1960 to a woman from a neighboring county. They had a child in 1962, a boy named David Lawrence. The marriage had ended in a bitter, highly publicized divorce a few years later. The mother had taken the boy and moved away. Chief Miller had rarely spoken of them. Most people in Oak Creek didn't even know the chief had a son. But in 1983, the son had come back. Chief Miller had brought David to Oak Creek. He had likely pulled strings to get David the job with Arthur at the hardware store. The horrific truth finally snapped fully into place, forming a picture so dark it made Alina feel like she was suffocating. David Miller had taken Lily. He had walked into the yard, unlatched the gate, and taken the little girl. And his father, the chief of police, had covered the entire thing up. Chief Miller had made the decoy phone call from the police station to ensure Alina was distracted. Chief Miller had called off the tracking dogs when they got too close. Chief Miller had controlled the search radius, ensuring nobody looked wherever David was hiding. And when the town started asking too many questions, Chief Miller had forged a phone document to destroy Arthur Vance, neatly tying up the case and protecting his own flesh and blood. They had destroyed her family to protect theirs. Alina pushed away from the microfiche machine. Her hands were shaking violently. She stood up in the dark basement, the white glow of the screen illuminating the tears streaming down her face. She felt a blinding, white-hot rage building in her chest. It was a fury born from 27 years of empty bedrooms, 27 years of silent birthdays, and 27 years of wondering if her daughter was lying dead in a ditch. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked over to the modern computer terminal on the archivist's desk. It was 2011. She did not need to rely on old film rolls to find out where someone lived today. She had access to the state's digitized public property tax records. She typed the name David Lawrence Miller into the search database. The screen blinked, loading the query. There were several results across the state, but Alina filtered the search by age. Only one matched. David Miller was now 50 years old. According to the tax records, he had purchased a large, secluded piece of property in Blackwood County in November of 1984, just 3 months after Lily vanished. It was a 10-acre farm, located at the end of a long, unpaved logging road, surrounded by dense, state-protected forest. The records indicated it had been purchased with a massive cash down payment. Alina knew instantly where that money had come from. Chief Miller had financed his son's escape. Alina printed the property map and the address. She folded the paper and shoved it into her pocket. She left the library, locking the heavy steel door behind her. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a thick, heavy fog rolling through the quiet streets of Oak Creek. The town looked peaceful, sleeping soundly under the orange glow of the streetlights. But to Alina, the town now felt like a graveyard built on a foundation of lies. She got back into her car. She did not drive home. She turned the steering wheel and headed toward the highway. Blackwood County was a 2-hour drive north. It was a region of the state known for deep ravines, thick pine forests, and isolated communities that did not welcome strangers. The roads were dark, twisting through the mountains with no guardrails and no streetlights. Alina drove in absolute silence. She didn't turn on the radio. Her mind was entirely focused on the destination. She didn't know what she was going to find. Logic told her that a man who kidnaps a child does not keep the child alive for 27 years. Logic told her she was driving into the dark to find a shallow grave hidden in the woods behind a farmhouse. She was prepared for that. She was prepared to dig through the dirt with her bare hands if she had to. She just needed the truth. She needed to bring her baby home, even if it was only to give her a proper burial. By the time Alina crossed the county line, the clock on the dashboard read 3:15 a.m. The fog was incredibly thick up in the mountains, swirling across the dark pavement like pale smoke. She turned onto the unpaved logging road marked on the printed map. The road was heavily rutted, bouncing her small car violently as she drove deeper into the woods. The trees grew tight against the sides of the road, their branches scraping against the windows like long wooden claws. There were no other houses. There were no lights. She was driving into total isolation. After 2 miles, the trees suddenly broke, revealing a large, open clearing. Alina immediately turned off her headlights. She let the car roll slowly to a stop on the gravel shoulder, pulling the parking brake as quietly as she could. Through the thick, swirling mist, the property slowly came into view. It was a bleak, imposing setup. The main farmhouse was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and dark, empty windows. It looked abandoned. The front porch was sagging, and the yard was overgrown with tall, brown weeds. But about 50 yards behind the house, standing massive and dark against the tree line, was a large, corrugated metal barn. Alina stepped out of the car. The cold mountain air bit through her clothes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own shoes crunching softly against the wet gravel. She pulled the heavy metal flashlight from her purse, but she did not turn it on. She didn't want to alert anyone who might be sleeping inside the house. She walked past the front porch of the farmhouse, keeping low, her eyes scanning the dark windows. There was no movement, no sound of breathing. The house felt completely empty. She moved toward the large metal barn in the back. As she got closer, she noticed something strange. The farmhouse was decaying and neglected, but the barn was in perfect condition. The metal siding was clean. The massive sliding doors at the front were secured with a heavy, modern steel padlock, and thick, reinforced chains were wrapped around the handles. High above the doors, an expensive security camera was mounted to the metal, its small red light blinking steadily in the dark. This was not an old farming barn. It was a vault. Alina's heart began to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She stayed out of the line of sight of the camera, creeping slowly along the side of the metal structure. She ran her hand along the cold steel, feeling for any weakness, any gap. About halfway down the side of the barn, she found a small, high window. It was covered in years of dirt and grime, and there were heavy iron bars bolted over the glass from the outside. Alina looked around the tall weeds. She found an old wooden crate sitting near a pile of rusted tractor parts. She dragged the crate as quietly as she could over to the wall. She stepped up onto it, balancing precariously, and pressed her face against the iron bars. She used the sleeve of her sweater to wipe away a small circle of dirt from the glass. She cupped her hands around her eyes to block out the ambient moonlight and peered inside. The interior of the barn was pitch black. She couldn't see anything. Taking a deep breath, Alina raised her flashlight. She pressed the lens directly against the glass and clicked the button. The bright beam of light shot through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the metal building. Alina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to muffle the sound. She almost fell backward off the wooden crate. She had expected to see a dark, dirty storage space. She had expected to see farming equipment, or empty space, or perhaps a patch of disturbed earth on a dirt floor. But what the flashlight revealed was impossible. It defied all logic. It shattered every horrible scenario she had built in her mind over the last 27 years. The interior of the massive metal barn was not an empty space. A completely separate, fully enclosed structure had been built inside the metal walls. It looked like a small, functioning house, constructed entirely out of finished wood and drywall, resting securely inside the dark shell of the barn. The window Alina was looking through lined up perfectly with a window in the interior structure. Her flashlight beam pierced straight through both panes of glass, illuminating a room inside. It was a bedroom. But it was not a prison cell. It was not a dark, terrifying dungeon. The room was painted a soft, cheerful yellow. There was a large, comfortable bed covered in a floral quilt. There were bookshelves lining the walls, packed tightly with novels, encyclopedias, and brightly colored binders. A small wooden desk sat in the corner, covered in pencils, notebooks, and a modern reading lamp. There were framed posters of landscapes and animals hung neatly on the walls. It was clean, it was warm, it was perfectly kept. Eleanor's hand shook so violently the flashlight beam danced wildly across the room. She forced herself to hold it steady, moving the light slowly across the wall above the small wooden desk. There was a large cork bulletin board bolted to the drywall. Pinned to the board were dozens of photographs. Eleanor strained her eyes, squinting through the dirt and the bars. The photographs were not of David. They were not old, faded memories. They were pictures of a young woman. The first photo showed a teenage girl with curly brown hair, smiling brightly in front of a birthday cake, holding up 16 fingers. The next photo showed the same girl, older now, sitting in an armchair reading a heavy book, looking annoyed that her picture was being taken. Another photo showed her laughing, wearing a sun hat, holding a basket of fresh vegetables inside what looked like a greenhouse. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. The ground seemed to spin beneath her feet. She traced the features of the woman in the photographs, the shape of the jaw, the curve of the nose, the bright, curious eyes. She would know that face anywhere. She would know it in the dark. She would know it at the end of the world. It was Lily. She wasn't dead. She wasn't buried in the woods. She had grown up. She was 33 years old and she was living inside this strange, hidden house inside a barn. But as Eleanor's mind violently tried to process the shock, the beam of her flashlight caught one final object resting on the pillow of the neatly made bed. It was a small, gray stuffed elephant. It was faded, worn, and missing one button eye. Barnaby, the toy that had been dropped in the mud. The toy Eleanor had clutched to her chest for decades. David hadn't just taken her daughter. He had gone back for the toy. He had preserved every piece of her childhood. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence of the night, shattering Eleanor's focus. It was the heavy, distinct crunch of tires on gravel. Eleanor clicked the flashlight off instantly, plunging the barn back into total darkness. She scrambled down from the wooden crate, her heart hammering wildly in her throat. She ducked down into the tall, wet weeds, pressing her back flat against the cold metal of the barn wall. Bright headlights swept across the fog, illuminating the front of the barn. A large, dark pickup truck pulled into the clearing and slowly came to a stop just a few feet from the massive sliding doors. The engine shut off, the headlights clicked to dark. Eleanor held her breath. She didn't dare move a single muscle. She was completely exposed, hidden only by the shadows of the overgrown grass. The heavy driver's side door creaked open. Heavy boots hit the gravel. "I'll get the lock," a deep, older male voice said. It was David. The voice was older, rougher, but the cadence was exactly the same as the young man who had sat at her kitchen table. Then the passenger side door opened. Lighter footsteps stepped out onto the dirt. "Did you get the seeds for the garden?" a soft, melodic voice asked. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut. Tears burned hot against her cold skin. The voice sent a shockwave of electricity straight through her heart. It was the voice of a grown woman, but the gentle, cautious tone was identical to the little 6-year-old girl who used to play in the sprinkler. "Yeah, I got them," David replied, the sound of heavy metal chains clanking as he unlocked the padlock. "We can plant them tomorrow morning. Go on inside. It's too cold out here." "Okay," the soft voice replied. "Good night, David." "Good night, Lily." The heavy sliding doors groaned open. The footsteps walked inside. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, and the deadbolt locked from the inside with a terrifying, final click. The truth was standing only inches away on the other side of the wall. And the final, shocking reality of exactly why Lily was taken and what she had become was about to be revealed. Eleanor stayed frozen against the cold metal of the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy metal doors had just locked shut, sealing her daughter inside with the man who had stolen her life. The silence of the mountain forest rushed back in, thick and suffocating. For 27 years, Alina had been a quiet, grieving woman. She had been polite. She had followed the rules. She had let the police dictate the investigation. She had let the town judge her husband. She had let the world walk all over her. But standing in the freezing, overgrown weeds, listening to the man who had destroyed her family lock the deadbolt, the quiet woman completely vanished. In her place was a mother, and a mother's instinct to protect her child is the most dangerous force on earth. Alina gripped the heavy metal flashlight in her right hand. She did not run back to her car. She did not drive away to find a working phone. She knew if she left this property, David might see her headlights, panic, and move Lily before she could ever return. She was not leaving without her daughter. She waited in the shadows. The fog grew thicker, clinging to the damp ground. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Alina's legs ached from crouching, but she did not move a single muscle. Suddenly, she heard the loud, heavy sound of the interior deadbolt clicking open. The massive sliding doors of the barn groaned as they were pushed apart. David stepped back out into the cold night air. He was muttering quietly to himself, patting the pockets of his heavy coat. He walked straight toward his dark pickup truck, clearly realizing he had left the packets of garden seeds inside the cab. He left the heavy barn doors open just a few inches. David opened the truck door and leaned inside, reaching across the bench seat. Alina stepped out of the tall grass. She moved with absolute, terrifying silence. She closed the distance between the barn and the truck in seconds. She raised the heavy metal flashlight high above her head. David began to turn around, a small paper packet of seeds in his hand. He never even saw her face. Alina brought the heavy flashlight down with every ounce of strength left in her 55-year-old body. The solid metal struck David squarely across the side of his head. The impact made a sickening, hollow sound. David let out a short, choked gasp. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed instantly into the wet gravel, completely unconscious. Alina stood over him, her chest heaving, the flashlight shaking in her hand. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt nothing but a cold, burning determination. She reached down, patted his coat pockets, and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. She turned away from his body and walked up to the slightly open barn doors. She pushed them wide apart and stepped inside. The interior of the massive metal barn was dark, but the small, custom-built house sitting in the center of the concrete floor was glowing with warm, yellow light. It looked like a movie set, perfectly constructed and completely bizarre. Alina walked up to the wooden front door of the inner structure. She found the right key on the ring, slid it into the lock and turned it. The lock clicked. Alina pushed the door open. She stepped into a small, beautifully decorated living room. There was a soft rug, a television set, and shelves lined with hundreds of classic movies on VHS and DVD. It was a perfectly preserved bubble of domestic life, completely disconnected from the real world. "David, did you find the seeds?" The soft voice came from the short hallway. Alina stopped breathing. She placed the flashlight on a small table by the door. She walked slowly toward the hallway. A woman stepped out of the bedroom doorway. She was wearing a simple cotton nightgown. Her curly brown hair fell softly over her shoulders. She looked so much like Alina had looked at 33 years old. It was like staring into a strange, living mirror. When the woman saw Alina standing in the living room, she froze. Her bright eyes widened in absolute terror. She immediately took 2 steps backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "Who are you?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling with panic. "How did you get in here? You can't be in here. The air is sick. You have to leave before you infect the house." The words struck Alina like a physical blow. The sick, twisted reality of David's crime finally became clear. He hadn't just locked Lily in a room. He had locked her mind in a cage. He had convinced a timid, frightened 6-year-old girl that the outside world was contaminated, that there was a terrible sickness, that everyone she loved had died, and he was the only one who could keep her safe. He had built this sealed fortress to protect her, and because she was only a child, she had believed him. She had spent 27 years believing David was her savior. "Lily," Alina said, her voice cracking, tears instantly flooding her eyes. "Lily, there is no sickness." Lily shook her head wildly, backing further into the hallway. "Stop! Don't come any closer. David said there are bad people out there. He said everyone died. How are you alive?" Alina took one slow, careful step forward. She held her hands out, showing they were empty. "I am alive because David lied to you, sweetie," Alina cried softly. "He lied to you for your entire life." "No," Lily sobbed, pressing her back against the wall. "He kept me safe. He brought me here when the sickness came to Oak Creek. He told me my mommy and daddy got sick." Alina felt her heart break into a million pieces. The pain of those words was unbearable, but she knew she had to stay calm. She had to reach the little girl trapped inside the grown woman's mind. "Lily, I want you to look at me," Alina said, letting the tears stream freely down her face. "Look at my eyes." Lily hesitated, her chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. She looked at Alina. "Do you remember the sprinkler?" Alina asked, her voice a soft, gentle whisper. "Do you remember the green hose and the bright yellow bathing suit? Do you remember the hot grass?" Lily's breath hitched. Her eyes darted around the room, as if trying to catch a fleeting dream. "Do you remember breakfast that morning?" Alina continued, taking another slow step closer. "We had pancakes, you were watching cartoons, and sitting right next to your juice glass was Barnaby." At the sound of that name, Lily let out a sharp gasp. Her hands slowly lowered from her mouth. "He fell in the mud," Alina said, her voice breaking into a sob. "When David took you out the gate, Barnaby fell in the mud. I found him, I washed him, and I kept him on your pillow for 27 years." Lily stared at Alina. The decades of brainwashing, the thousands of lies David had told her to keep her docile and afraid, slowly began to crack. Deep down, buried under 27 years of fear, a primal memory unlocked. She looked at Alina's face. She looked at the shape of her jaw, the curve of her nose, and the deep, unconditional love shining in her tear-filled eyes. "Mommy," Lily whispered, the voice of a frightened 6-year-old echoing perfectly in the quiet room. Alina could not hold back any longer. She rushed forward and threw her arms around her daughter. Lily collapsed against her, burying her face in Alina's shoulder. They fell to the floor together in the narrow hallway, holding each other so tightly it physically hurt. The dam broke. They sobbed, a loud, ragged wailing that released 27 years of grief, fear, and stolen time. Alina kissed Lily's hair over and over again, rocking her back and forth on the floor. "I'm here," Alina cried. "I'm right here, I'm taking you home." 10 minutes later, Alina led Lily out of the custom-built house and into the dark, massive metal barn. Lily kept her eyes squeezed shut, terrified of the outside air, but she gripped her mother's hand with desperate strength. In her other hand, she clutched Barnaby the elephant. They walked out into the cold night. David was still lying unconscious in the wet gravel. Alina did not even look at him. She guided Lily into the passenger seat of her car, locked the doors, and turned the heater on high. Alina did not drive back to Oak Creek. She drove directly to the state capitol, pulling up to the headquarters of the State Bureau of Investigation just as the sun began to rise over the horizon. When Alina walked into the brightly lit lobby, holding the hand of a woman who had been declared legally dead over 2 decades ago, the entire building stopped. The resolution of the case was swift, massive, and merciless. State troopers swarmed the farm in Blackwood County. They arrested David Miller as he was stumbling down the logging road, his head bleeding from the flashlight strike. When the state investigators tore the custom-built house apart, they found David's journals. The journals detailed his severe, unchecked psychological delusions. He believed the modern world was deeply corrupt and dangerous. He had become obsessed with Lily's innocence when he worked at the hardware store. He believed her parents were going to ruin her, so he decided to save her. He wanted to preserve her exactly as she was. The investigation quickly exposed the dark rot inside the Oak Creek Police Department. The state police uncovered the forged phone records. They uncovered the secret bank transfers from the late Chief Miller to his son. Chief Miller had realized what his son had done within hours of the kidnapping, but instead of arresting his own child, he used his power to cover it up. He orchestrated the decoy phone call report. He directed the search parties away from the state highway. He intentionally framed Arthur Vance, a good, innocent man, completely destroying Arthur's life to keep his son out of prison. Chief Miller had died years ago, escaping earthly justice, but his reputation was completely annihilated. His name was stripped from the town hall. His protege, Chief Harris, was forced to resign in disgrace for failing to review the old evidence. David Miller was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and psychological abuse. He was sentenced to life in a maximum security state penitentiary, locked in a cell where he would never see the outside world again. But the most important justice was for Arthur. The state police held a massive press conference, broadcasted across the entire country. The lead investigator stood before the cameras and officially, completely cleared Arthur Vance's name. He declared Arthur a loving father who had been the victim of a monstrous police conspiracy. Arthur was not there to hear it, but his grave in the town cemetery was covered in hundreds of flowers from a community desperately trying to apologize for their cruelty. The aftermath of the rescue was a long, difficult road. Lily had to learn how to exist in a world she believed had ended in 1984. The internet, cell phones, and modern cars terrified her at first. She needed extensive therapy to break down the walls David had built in her mind. But she was incredibly strong, and she was not alone. Alina sold the house in Oak Creek. She took the money and bought a beautiful, quiet cottage near the ocean, far away from the dark pine trees and the memories of the heavy wooden gate. She and Lily lived there together. They spent their days walking on the beach, cooking meals in the bright kitchen, and catching up on thousands of missed conversations. Slowly, the fear faded from Lily's eyes, replaced by the bright, curious spark of the little girl who used to play in the summer rain. The story of the little girl in the yellow bathing suit became a legend. It was a terrifying reminder of how easily trust can be weaponized, and how the darkest secrets can be hidden right in plain sight. It showed that evil does not always look like a monster in the dark. Sometimes, it looks like a smiling young man at the hardware store, or a respected police chief wearing a badge. But more than anything, the story proved that the bond between a mother and her child cannot be broken by time, distance, or a wooden wall. The truth had slept in the dark inside a silver camera for 27 years, waiting patiently for the moment it could bring a lost girl back into the light.